Okay, so you will see this diagram tomorrow. It is actually set up as matching, so there's nothing you have to fill in the blank or anything like that. Um, but what we talked about, and I still have the stuff on here marked from what we did last hour. But first of all, let's focus on the hair. I mean, you guys should know that this is hair, all right? They call that part, that visible part, the hair shaft, okay? And where it comes down to, this structure here is the hair follicle, okay? So we have the hair follicle down there in the dermis. We have these lumpy things attached to the side up here. And what those actually are sebaceous oil glands. So now we have three things kind of associated with each other. We have the hair shaft and the hair follicle. Makes sense. And then associated with that as well is the sebaceous gland, okay, or sebaceous glands. We also have a muscle attached here to the side. It's showing it cut because of this being like a section of skin. So this is actually the erector pili muscle. When that contracts, it can generate heat, but also when it contracts, it makes the hair stand up and forms goosebumps. You'll actually find that question on there tomorrow as well. What forms goosebumps? It's because of this muscle contracting. Okay. So right there, boom, right off the bat, we have four things labeled. We should, of course, also be able to label the layers of the skin. So we have this top layer here is the epidermis, and then below that is the dermis. And easy enough to see the difference between the two is if you look for the wavy lines. Okay, so these waves here that I'm kind of drawing, and you can especially see them. They kind of did a pull away part to separate the layers over here. But so where you see that wavy layer, above that's going to be the epidermis, and below that's going to be the dermis. So we talked about sebaceous glands. We also have this kind of coiled up tube here, and that's actually a sweat gland. And so the sweat gets produced there. It needs to have a way to get to the surface. And so we call that a sweat gland duct. Sweat gland duct. And the opening at the surface is called a pore, sweat pore. All right. You can see something on there if you're wondering, like these things. You do not need to know those things. But these are nerve receptors, just so you know. But what is good to know is that the parts attached to them, of course, are wiring. You'll also see wiring going to the base of the hair follicle here. You'll see wiring going to the erector pili muscle. See wiring going all the way, going up to these receptors up here. Okay, the wiring is the what? Any idea? Nerves. Okay, so nerves, might see it as nerve fibers. All right. Now here's something that we didn't, oh, forgot something here. At the bottom here is the hypodermis, which is technically under the skin. It's not technically part of the skin, it's technically under the skin. It's also called the subcutaneous layer. So you should know that subcutaneous layer and hypodermis are the same thing. Okay? The hypodermis, by the way, is made up of loose connective tissue and adipose tissue, which adipose tissue is just fat. You should see that question tomorrow about hypodermis being loose connective tissue and adipose tissue. This yellow stuff here, by the way, is fat. That's the adipose tissue there. And you'll see some kind of bare spots in between where we have loose connective tissue. What about these red and blue tubes here? What are they? Blood vessels. Okay, so we have blood vessels here. You see they're running right along the bottom of the dermis and, of course, go up through the more superficial parts of the dermis. But so if we look at these waves I mentioned, okay, we've got these different waves. What that does is increase the surface area here. But so if we look from the dermal part, the dermis, it's raised then in those ridges. That's called dermal papillae, and that will be on there tomorrow. And that's maybe one that you're not like automatic within your brain yet. So pay attention to dermal papillae. And that's also responsible for giving us our fingerprints. Okay? Which is another question you'll see. Dermal papillae, fingerprints. And so the stuff I just mentioned right there, that's what would be matching for this diagram. Okay? And then just some kind of general stuff. So the integument itself, the integumentary system, has two major components. And you guys probably think right away, what is the integumentary system? Skin, hair, nails. Good. Technically, skin, hair, nails, and glands. And so if we divide that up into two parts, it's really like saying there's the skin and then there's the other stuff. Okay? The skin part we call the cutaneous membrane. So one of the major components of the integument is the skin, which we call cutaneous membrane. And then the other major component is the rest of the stuff, which we call accessory structures. So I would ask you, what are the two major components? You should know cutaneous membrane and accessory structures. You should also know what the accessory structures are. So if you think about the integumentary system being skin, hair, nails, and glands, we know that skin is cutaneous membrane, so accessory structures must be the rest: hair, nails, glands. Okay? We should, of course, also know the functions of the integumentary system. I do remember, I think somebody, I'm not sure if it was in this class or not, came up with a thing to remember. I believe it was PESTS, P-E-S-T-S. Take a look at that and see if that helps you. I forgot to say that to first hour, so if you're a first hour student watching this video, that's a very important part I just said for you, because people in class that are not watching this video did not get that. Bad teacher. All right. I asked a question about as skin cells are pushed up toward the surface. So skin cells divide at the beginning of their life. They're dividing and making new cells, and they gradually push the older cells toward the surface. Okay? So a couple different things happen as the cells move towards the surface. One of them is that they start producing this stuff called keratin. Excuse me, keratin with a K. Keratin is like a clear, tough, fibrous protein. It's mainly a protect us. Okay. This is one of the reasons, and I believe somebody answered this way on the review yesterday. If we had this question, I think we did. One thing that happens to cells as they move towards the surface, they die, and that's okay because we aren't concerned about our skin cells at the surface doing the things that normal cells might do, carrying out normal routines. Really, we want them to die. We want them to just be like almost like little scales to protect us. That's the main idea. There are at least a few questions about layers of the epidermis. Okay? So layers of the epidermis, we have a way of remembering that. What was the way of remembering that, BTW? What is it? Come, let's get sunburned. Come, let's get sunburned. And that helps us, well, starts us off on the right track by knowing the first letter of each layer from the outermost, the most superficial, to deep. And so the outermost layer, and these are all strata. Strata means layers, but so the outermost layer will be stratum corneum. In thick skin, we would have the stratum lucidum. Below that, we would have the stratum granulosum. So if it's thin skin, we don't have that layer. It just goes stratum corneum, stratum granulosum. Below the granulosum, we would have the stratum spinosum. And the lowest layer of the epidermis would be the stratum basale, or germinativum, it's also called. Okay, Duque. Real easy to remember. Anytime you see blood, blood vessels, anything to do with that, we're talking about the dermis. Blood vessels. Which nutrients, of course? Dermis. So this is another thing, another reason why those cells of the epidermis die as they go through their life cycle. Not only are they becoming packed with this tough fibrous protein keratin, it's filling the cell so they can't do anything else. They're also moving up away from their nutrient source, which is the dermis. Talk about pigments. Okay, and so pigment, melanin, it's a good protector. It protects our nuclei in our cells, protects the DNA from getting damaged, possibly causing mutations, possibly causing cancers, which we did talk about cancers a little bit. I didn't talk about that with the first hour either. But melanin's a good protector. Melanin is an example of a pigment. It's a dark pigment, black, brown pigment. It gets produced in response to exposure to sunlight, UV rays. Not right away. It takes a little while. So if we don't have a lot of melanin production and we're exposed to a lot of UV rays, that can be dangerous. We can get burned easily. Remember, it's important to remember that regardless of who we're talking about with skin color, we all have about the same number of melanocytes. Melanocytes are the type of cells that produce melanin. The thing that's different is how much melanin is being produced. If more melanin is produced normally, then you're going to have darker skin. If you produce less melanin, then you're going to have lighter skin. Things that contribute to skin color, so obviously the pigments we just talked about, melanin. There's another orange pigment we talked about. I said, hey, don't get this mixed up with keratin because it's carotene, which is an orange pigment, right? It starts with a C. The beginning of the word is just like carrot. If it had another R, carrots are orange. Orange pigment, keratin with a C, not keratin with a K. Keratin with a K is a protein tough protector, okay? So if we're just talking about skin color then, we have pigments. The pigments actually are in the epidermis, okay? And blood circulation also affects our skin color. And of course, being blood, anything to do with blood, blood vessels is going to be in the dermis. So what they normally say is the two factors that contribute to skin color are going to be epidermal pigmentation and dermal circulation. So like, for example, if you're going to notice blood circulation plays a role in people with lighter skin. If you have darker skin, you're not going to really notice as much. But for example, if we get hot and we're trying to cool down, our body's trying to cool down, then one of the things it can do is blood vessels can dilate, which means they get larger, and they bring more blood to the surface. And more blood towards the surface is going to give a reddish appearance. If we get cold, it's going to go the other way. If we're cold, our body's going to want to conserve heat, and the blood vessels are going to actually constrict and get smaller, bringing less blood toward the surface. And if that happens, then we can have a pale appearance. So exposure to sunlight can be a good thing. We produce melanin. We already talked about that's one thing that happens when we're exposed to UV rays. Another thing, it's important that we get sunlight and UV rays because this stimulates the production of something called vitamin D. Okay, vitamin D, that's going to be important so that we're able to eventually take in calcium and phosphorus, which is going to be important, especially for our bones. skeletal system, another way that body systems are interacting. And of course, there are cons to sunlight exposure, like cancers. So 3 types of cancer, skin cancer that we talked about. Malignant melanoma. That's a super danger. We want to get that taken care of before that spreads into the lymph nodes and spreads through the lymph system, because the lymph system goes everywhere. This can kill you. Okay, that's called metastasizing. That's the most severe type. The most common is basal cell, but that's not going to metastasize, so we can usually just get that taken care of. Squamous cell, so squamous cell means the flattened cells that are more superficial. But these two, not saying if you ever ran into a situation where you think you might have one of these, just leave it. But not usually fatal. They don't usually spread. Malignant melanoma, yes. Bad news bears. Okay? And I think that pretty much covers everything there.